going to have a look at 4 basic principles of design. And the goal here is to begin to develop a vocabulary that we can use in order to discuss data visualization. Up till now, we've really just considered one metric for whether something is well designed. And it's whether it allows the user to accomplish a desired task. And of course, we also considered whether we could do it easily or naturally, but it's all generally the same idea. While this gives us good insight into what good design should strive to do, it doesn't really provide us the means by which to discuss design in a way that's useful either for ourselves when we're analyzing our own work and trying to decide where it can be improved or not, or when we're trying to communicate to someone else, perhaps in a critiquing environment, how they can change their design in order to make it better. So that's today's task. What we're going to do is we're going to borrow from the world of graphic design. And hopefully we can all agree that data visualizations are very graphic, and so it makes sense to borrow their language in order to begin the process of developing a vocabulary for discussing data visualizations. Today, the principles that we look at are going to be very general. Essentially, what we want to be able to do is discuss why the image on the left looks so great, while the image on the right does not. And I think many of us can agree that the one on the left looks inviting, it draws us in, it's easy to process the information, while the one on the right is sort of sloppy, makes it difficult for us to understand what's being said and to process it. While we can articulate that, keeping in mind the overall goal of design, which is to enable the user to accomplish a task, we don't really have yet the vocabulary to discuss specifically why it's failing. So let's begin that process today, and we'll look at a few general design principles taken from the world of graphic design. And there's 4 of them. The principles of consistency, contrast, proximity, and alignment. These are basic general principles, but are widely applicable to all the work that we'll be considering. And so having a good understanding of what they are and how they work is really going to help us improve both how we discuss data visualizations and also how we approach making data visualizations. So let's dive right in. The 4 principles, if we think about them, are, again, consistency, contrast, proximity, and alignment. And we'll start just going down the list. The principle of consistency is that unless we have a reason for something to be different, we should make everything the same. And what this helps us avoid is a crazy mess where everything that we see vies equally for our attention. And there's so much information and so many places to look, we don't know where it is that our attention needs to be, even when we're specifically being told where we should be looking. Because there's so many different elements, our brain struggles to process where we should be looking. And consistency says we can alleviate this problem by making everything as similar as possible. And here we can take what we're looking at and improve it by removing all the colors and all the different font types so that we have something that looks a little bit more consistent. This improves the situation and is a little bit easier to tell where we're supposed to be looking. However, it's still a little hard, and the reason is that we have many different lengths of statements. And so our brain is still processing those as all different. If instead what we do is we change the wording to all be the same, increasing the consistency, it becomes a little bit easier again to understand where it is that we're supposed to be looking. Of course, it's still not super easy, although it is much easier than it used to be. And so what we can do then is use the second principle, which is the principle of contrast, in order to improve our brain's ability to recognize where it is our attention should be. And contrast says that when we want something to look different, we should make it look very different. So let's go ahead and do that. If we take this image on the right and then take the element we want people to notice and make it look very different, now it's immediately obvious where our attention should be. And if I move around where this box is, it will be the first thing you notice every single time. Good use of contrast is like that. It's almost like a form of mind control, where I can force your brain to notice where I want it to notice. Now, even though it looks like this is easy and we just make something bright, it's important to remember that consistency and contrast are really 2 sides of the same coin. And without consistency, contrast doesn't work. Even if we retain this bright color, if we go back to the situation that we had elsewise before we implement the principle of consistency, it's still hard to notice where we are. And again, it's because our brain, even though we have this bright red that we know we want people to look at, our brain is struggling to pick that out amidst all the other things that are different here. So we must employ consistency first, and that allows us to use contrast. Here, of course, I've used bright red. Bright red is something that we tend to notice easily, so I've sort of dialed the contrast up almost as high as I can. But there are other ways to achieve contrast as well. And I can also control where your attention is using things like increasing the width of the outline on the box, changing the size of the box, changing the shape of the box. The key is to make the thing where I want you to notice look very different from everything else that surrounds it. And by doing that, that difference will be what your brain cues in on and looks at first. Something else we should consider is the principle of proximity, which states that we should put things that are similar as close together as is reasonably possible in our design. Consider here this idea of where I want you to look. Rather than using red to create that, I can use the principle of proximity. Maybe having two groups of 4, it's still somewhat hard to tell where you are supposed to be looking. But if I take all the things that are not where you're supposed to be looking and group them together, it becomes more obvious that one thing is different from everything else. And of course, you might be thinking here you're just using proximity to create contrast, and that is true. And it's also tied up with our next point of alignment, which is also true. But there's other ways that we can use proximity that aren't quite so convolved with these other principles. For instance, imagine we had all these circles here. And if you look at this long enough, you'll figure out what the patterns are, and perhaps you'll come up with a grouping that looks something like this. But here I've used proximity, and it's immediately clear. You don't have to look and think about what's going on. You just know that we have 3 different groups. One is capital letters, one's lowercase letters, and one's numbers. And we use the principle of proximity to put these things close together and farther away from other things, so that we can easily recognize that without having to do a lot of processing. Again, this is what we're after with design. I want to control what the user notices, and I want to make it easy for them to notice the things I want them to notice. Now, we can also employ alignment to clean this up, to give a relationship between the items in the group that strengthen that feeling that they are together. And that's one of the things that alignment can do. And this principle of alignment basically states that if we put something on a page or on a screen, it should have a relationship to some other item on that page or screen. This gives us a sense of a cohesive whole, and that's really nice for making our designs feel not sloppy. However, there's more that can be done. We can also use alignment to help users process information if we want, perhaps by making alignment between the positions of items between the groups as well. And if I do that, I can make it very clear to the observer that what we have are 3 different groups, all going from 1 to 4, but in some cases they go from 1 to 3, and in some cases we skip the 3rd element. And all that processing, again, happens much more easily when we're employing the principle of alignment properly. We can even do things like add in other elements that are a little different, that clue us in that there is this alignment going on if we want to make that feeling even stronger. But hopefully what we see is these 4 elements are 4 basic tools that really help us communicate to the reader what it is that we want them to notice on the page and how we want them to organize the information. And it shouldn't come as any surprise, because these are such basic principles for graphic design, that we see them often in well-designed objects, and we can articulate how they're missing from objects that we perceive as poorly designed. For instance, consider this movie poster, which I think is very well designed. This poster employs contrast and consistency quite well. The consistency happens when we have most of the text being gray and white on here. And then the contrast is, of course, the use of this giant red circle and the orange outline, which draws our attention immediately to this emblem. Then there's also a great use of proximity. The proximity places things like it's a Steven Spielberg film, and also the tagline close to the thing that we're noticing first, so that we process all this as a whole. And largely, it tells us we can ignore all this stuff at the bottom if we want to. I mean, the information's there for people who are really into film industry stuff, but otherwise, we know this is the area we're supposed to be looking. And then, of course, alignment gives it a feeling of everything being connected because everything's just center aligned right down the page. You don't have to make everything always center aligned or left justified or right justified, but when you do, it does give this very cohesive sense to the design that you make. We can now return to our item that we thought was well designed in the very beginning of this video and understand why it appears to be well designed. It uses the principle of consistency pretty well. Basically, we have the same font type in the heading. We have a second font type down here that's consistent across as well. Other than that, we have contrast between the colors that tells us that the left is somehow different from the right. The proximity is good because we've grouped all the items together in the middle, which helps us understand that basically this is where we should be processing information, is in the middle of the plot. And then alignment works well. We're center aligned, which sort of draws our eye down and gives us the impression that these things are being placed into a bin, either the recycle bin or the trash bin. So in general, this is a fairly well-designed flyer that follows our 4 principles of design. This also lets us articulate why things sometimes fail. And so we look at, again, the example in the beginning that we thought was sloppy. Part of why we interpret it as sloppy is because there's no consistency. We have several different types of font present. And so that means that we struggle to know exactly where to look. There's also different orientations of the font, different styles of font, bold and italics, different colors of font. Altogether, nothing really presents much consistency. And because of that, it's hard to use contrast to direct our attention somewhere. Maybe the most contrasty thing is this recycle emblem, basically just because it's the only thing that looks simple on the page. And so our eye is drawn there, which is nice, but we don't know what else to process on here and in what order. When I think about proximity, we have a similar problem. Maybe I kind of understand that recycling goes with furniture, toys, clothing, all these things. But then I also don't know what this is over here. Maybe it's supposed to have proximity with this X behind it, so the X indicates that we're not going to recycle these, and the check indicates we do. But it's still not really clear when I look at this because there's so much going on that maybe I don't notice the check in the X to begin with. Alignment is a problem. There is alignment with this list, so I can sort of piece together that this list is separate from this list and it's separate from all the other font. But then there's no real relationship between this list and any of the other words on here. There's certainly no relationship with this list. And so they sort of float off in space. And again, I don't have an idea of what I'm trying to group them with. And so the reason why this looks sloppy is basically because the alignment doesn't allow us to group things together, nor does the proximity. In addition, there's basically no consistency, and so we don't know where to look first. So we have this sort of sloppy thing that makes it hard for us to process what's happening. Of course, we can also run into problems when we violate only single elements of this. And so I don't know about you, but every time I go to the Penn State course search, I'm frustrated to use it. And the reason is because it fails to use one of our criteria. I think the consistency is pretty good, actually. Most things look the same, and I can tell that the title up here is different from everything else. And so that kind of works. Proximity, things that go together are grouped together. When I think about alignment, it's pretty good for a basic web page, except of course there's no alignment or relationship between these buttons and anything else on the page. And so there's a place that alignment has failed and kind of makes the page feel amateur and sloppy. Where I think we have problems is contrast. I can tell the difference between the title and these entry fields, but what I can't tell is which of these entry fields is important. There's no contrast in the main part of this page. And because of that, I don't have a sense of where I need to input something first. it doesn't give me an entry point into this website. And so it makes it frustrating to use because I'm never quite sure what it is I'm supposed to do first. Now, not only can we use these basic principles of design to help us understand how to discuss and critique things that we see, we can use it to help us create things. And if we keep these principles in mind, we can go through them and improve a design that we're creating simply by keeping them in mind. Let's consider, for instance, if we had to make a book title that was talking about how to make something that's designed. If we don't employ any of these principles, you get kind of a hot mess like what we have here, where we don't have any consistency, no relationship between anything. I don't know where to look. There's no good contrast. Alignment's a problem. And so let's just go through and iteratively improve this as we go through our elements of design. Of course, when you're making a design, you don't need to go through in the order that we're going through. We're just going to go down the list because it's an easy way to handle things now. In the real world, you'll probably just be going back and forth between these, and I would say even when you think you're done, go back and go through the list and ask yourself, what elements can I improve corresponding to these principles? But for now, let's just start at the beginning and go to the end. The first thing then we need to fix is our use of consistency. Right now, there's different font types, different font styles, different fonts, and so the first thing to do is just to clean this up, make everything the same. Of course, even though this improves the look of the design a little bit, we don't have any contrast, so we don't know where to look. I would say that this is a nonfiction book, and so a lot of times the thing we want people to notice is the title, because it's the title that tells us what the book is going to be about, and most people are most curious about what a book is about when we're thinking about nonfiction. And so let's make the title bold. Now, if this were a fiction book, maybe we would care more about the author, because the title might not tell us too much about what the story is about, but we trust the author, and so we're interested in reading whatever it is that they're producing. Since this is a nonfiction book, we'll make the title bold. Then we can turn to proximity. Proximity tells us put the things that belong together or are linked together, or that we want the user to think are linked, put those close together and separate everything else from it. Here, it's probably the title and the subtitle that we want people to associate together, and the byline is the thing that feels very different. And so let's just space these things out, put the title and the subtitle together, and who wrote it farther apart. And actually, this makes it so easy to process what's going on, we can even get rid of the word by. And when we do that, people will recognize that at the top we have a title and a subtitle, and at the bottom there's a name, and that must be who wrote it. And so we're making it easy for the user to process the information that we're presenting to them. Finally, we have alignment. And again, alignment can do things like give us a cohesive whole, make the design feel well thought out, and we do this by just simply making sure that there's alignment of the text. And of course, there's many different places we could ensure that there's alignment, and all we're really doing is making sure that if we put something on the page, it has a relationship to something else. And what this does then is it gives us a much improved design just simply by going through this list of design elements and principles. And of course, we could do this then multiple times, and as we understand what's going on and iterate through them multiple times, we might come up with even a better design, something that we think not only looks attractive, but perhaps lets us do something clever. In this case, we've made a title and a subtitle that tell us a story, sharing a word. And we're using the ideas of contrast and alignment to force the reader to process that word twice. And so here we have an introduction to design, in which we're going to design a totally fake book cover, which is what we just did. And with that, we're done thinking through these 4 basic principles of design. We'll see them over and over again. We'll reference them multiple times in all future interactions that we have. And I hope that you'll find, as we do this, that they are a very powerful tool that help you think about and communicate how design works, how to improve design, and that you can do this with your own work too, so that as you're building up a design, you can ensure you're producing something that's going to look clean, cohesive, easy to read, in short, something that's well designed.